I never expected that opening an email could make my hands shake the way they did that night. It was supposed to be harmless. One of those ancestry DNA kits Laura insisted we all take for fun during Christmas. She thought it would be cute to see which side of the family had more Viking blood. We sent them in, laughed about it, and forgot all about it. Weeks later, I opened my results while finishing a late report, not expecting my entire life to split in half between one click and the next. My name appeared at the top, followed by a cascade of familiar connections, cousins, parents, and then, under immediate family, two names, Laura, listed as spouse, and Noah, listed as close relative, likely nephew. I remember staring at the word nephew for what felt like hours. I refreshed the page 3 times, thinking maybe the system glitched. But every time, the same small word appeared, mocking me with scientific precision. The screen glowed too bright against the dark room, and suddenly the entire house felt smaller, like the walls were listening. I didn't move for a long time. My brain refused to connect the obvious dots. Mark's name was right there too, immediate family, brother, high DNA match. When I clicked Noah's profile, the overlap percentage between him and Mark made everything inside me go still. 99.9% paternal match. It didn't hit me like an explosion. It was quiet, surgical, like someone reached into my chest and turned a switch off. My son, my brother's son, and my wife, the woman who had cried in my arms during the pregnancy scare, who said she'd never felt closer to me. I closed the laptop, sat back in my chair, and waited for some kind of emotional reaction, anger, tears, anything. But all I felt was a hollow space where love used to be. For the next few days, I became a ghost in my own home. Laura noticed I was quieter, but she assumed it was work stress. She'd kiss me goodnight and scroll on her phone while I stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together how long it had been going on. Mark and I used to be close. He was the kind of brother people envied. We grew up sharing everything, even secrets. I defended him countless times when he messed up. And now the one person I'd never protect him from was sleeping down the hall, next to my son who carried his blood. I found myself studying them when they played together, the identical tilt of their heads when they laughed, the same dimple that only appeared on one side. How had I never seen it? It was like the universe had been laughing in my face for 3 years. The breaking point came one evening when Laura handed me a drawing Noah made at kindergarten. "That's you, Daddy," she said, smiling. But the figure next to him wasn't me. It was Mark, the same beard, the same haircut, even the same tattoo outline on his arm. "He loves his uncle," she laughed. I nodded, feeling something inside me fracture. That night, I sat in the car outside our house, engine off, listening to the rain drum against the windshield. I could finally feel the rage now, slow, heavy, deliberate. I wasn't going to confront her in some screaming match. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. No, I was going to make sure every lie she told burned quietly, one truth at a time. So I ordered another DNA kit under fake names. One for myself, one for Noah, one for Mark. I sent them off without a word. While I waited, I replayed every family memory in my mind like surveillance footage. Christmas dinners, birthday parties. That time Mark offered to babysit so Laura could rest. Every moment became evidence. When the second set of results came back, they confirmed everything the first test did, only colder, more official. I printed them out, sealed them in an envelope, and placed it in my desk drawer. I didn't need confrontation. I needed patience. Because the thing about betrayal is, it robs you once when it happens, and again when you react too soon. I decided I'd never let them see me break. I'd smile, I'd laugh, I'd play the role of the clueless husband just a little longer. Because the best revenge doesn't explode. It unfolds. It's strange how easy it is to pretend once you've accepted the truth. Pretending became my armor. Every morning I woke up beside Laura and acted like nothing had changed. I'd make her coffee, kiss her forehead, ask about her plans, and play the devoted husband she thought she still had. The first few days, I could barely stand hearing her voice, but the longer I played the role, the calmer I became. I started observing her the way a detective studies a suspect, small lies disguised as affection, glances that lasted too long when my brother's name came up. I memorized them all, like lines from a play I'd been forced to perform in. What saved me was detachment. Once love dies, it doesn't leave a wound, it leaves clarity. And clarity can be terrifying when it finally comes. The weekends were the hardest. Mark came around often, pretending to help with the house or play with Noah. The first time after I knew, I almost couldn't look at him. He laughed that same easy laugh he always had, talking about his new business, clapping my back as if nothing in the world could touch our brotherhood. Laura would smile from the kitchen doorway, and I'd catch the faintest shimmer in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or fear. I'd respond with warmth, ask him to stay for dinner, pour his favorite whiskey. Each moment I stayed calm, I could feel their unease growing. They couldn't read me anymore. That was the point. One evening, while Laura was washing dishes, I leaned against the counter and said, "You know, I was thinking of surprising Mark with something. He's been helping out a lot lately." Her shoulders stiffened just slightly before she turned, smiling too quickly. "That's sweet of you," she said, voice too light. "He deserves it." I smiled back, holding her gaze. "Yeah," I replied softly, "he really does." The way her eyes darted down told me everything I needed to know. She thought I suspected something, but not enough to act. That's exactly where I wanted her. I began collecting pieces, not for court, not even for confrontation, but for control. Photos, receipts, their text history backed up through our shared cloud, moments I could use if I ever needed to corner them. I never told anyone, not my parents, not my closest friends. Secrets are most powerful when they belong to only one person. At work, I performed normally, but in my head, I was building something. A plan. I didn't want revenge through chaos. I wanted precision. Pain delivered like a scalpel, not a hammer. Mark started inviting me to more of his events, family barbecues, birthdays, little get-togethers where Laura could blend in as the perfect wife. I always said yes. I wanted him to feel safe near me, wanted her to believe I was still blind. At one party, he raised his glass and said, "You've always been my rock, man. I don't know what I'd do without you." Everyone laughed and cheered, but his words hit differently. Laura froze mid-smile. I met her eyes across the table, held her stare just long enough for her to look away. That night, she tried to initiate intimacy, desperate maybe to prove something to herself, but I turned away gently, saying I was tired. She didn't ask again for weeks. The silence between us grew thicker, but she mistook it for emotional distance, not strategy. When she finally asked if something was wrong, I smiled and said, "You're imagining things. Everything's perfect." She looked at me for a long time that night, as if searching for the man she thought she knew. I let her look. The less she recognized me, the more control I had. I started helping more around the house, cooking dinners, spending more time with Noah, my son in name, but not in blood. He'd hand me his toy cars and giggle, and sometimes that simple joy cut deeper than anything else. But I'd remind myself, he's innocent. My revenge isn't against a child. It's against the adults who lied to him, who lied to me. The plan began to take shape after I received an invitation to a charity gala Mark was organizing, a fundraiser for family wellness programs. The irony wasn't lost on me. He wanted me to give a small speech as a successful donor. I said yes immediately. That was when the idea hit me, quiet but clear. What if the entire world saw their secret without me ever raising my voice? I didn't know exactly how yet, but that night, as I stood in front of the mirror brushing my teeth beside Laura, I saw it in my reflection, the version of me she couldn't predict anymore. She asked softly, "You're quieter lately. Are you okay?" I met her eyes through the mirror and said, "I'm fine, Laura. Just thinking about the future." She smiled, not realizing that I'd already started rewriting it. The hardest part of acting is not pretending to love, it's pretending not to hate. Every touch, every kiss, every casual lie became a rehearsal for what was coming. I began documenting dates, archiving files, planning something larger than just humiliation. I wanted their betrayal to consume itself, to become its own punishment. Every move I made was deliberate, polite messages, thoughtful gestures, everything to make them believe I was healing. And in that calm, I found power, real power, because revenge doesn't live in rage. It lives in patience. And I was done being the fool who forgave. The night I began planning everything, I didn't write a single word. I just sat in the living room surrounded by silence and watched the shadows move across the floor. I wasn't looking for a way to hurt them. I was looking for a way to make them feel the kind of stillness that had been eating me alive for months. It had to be quiet, deliberate, and permanent, something that couldn't be undone with apologies or explanations. I kept remembering how Laura laughed when she said we should take that stupid DNA test. She had no idea that her laughter would become the soundtrack of her own destruction. Mark's gala invitation sat on the table, printed on thick paper, with gold lettering and his smug name under event chair. Family Wellness Initiative, strengthening homes, building trust. The hypocrisy was almost poetic. He wanted me to speak about resilience and forgiveness. I smiled at the irony. Maybe that would be my stage, not for the speech he expected, but for the truth they both deserved. But revenge couldn't just be loud. It had to be perfect. I needed more than emotion. I needed structure. I started sketching ideas in a notebook, drawing arrows between names, events, and opportunities. If you'd looked at it, you'd think I was planning a corporate merger, not the unmaking of two people. The next few weeks, I started collecting footage. Photos from family gatherings, candid moments where Mark's hand lingered a little too long on Laura's shoulder, screenshots of texts I'd quietly restored from her deleted folders. I didn't plan to leak them, not yet, but I wanted evidence woven into something poetic, something that told the story without words. I visited a friend from college who did digital design and told him I was creating a short documentary for a charity launch, a visual story about family, loyalty, and loss. He agreed to help. I sent him dozens of clips and photos, telling him I wanted it to feel raw and real. I gave him a voiceover script written in the third person, a fictionalized narration about a man who learns that betrayal can only be healed through truth. He didn't know he was editing my life. At home, Laura started noticing my late nights, but never pressed too hard. "You're working too much," she said one evening, massaging my shoulders. I forced a smile and told her, "It's almost done. I'm preparing something special." She kissed my cheek, whispering, "You always do." The sweetness in her voice twisted my stomach. Every word out of her mouth felt like poison dipped in honey. I wanted to hate her completely, but hate isn't clean. It drips, it stains, it confuses. There were nights when I'd look at her asleep beside me and think about how it might have been if honesty had mattered more than pleasure. Then I'd remember the DNA report and the image of my brother's name under biological father, and the sympathy would disappear like smoke. Meanwhile, Mark was thriving, at least on the surface. His business was doing well. He had media interviews lined up, and he kept calling me my rock, my best friend, the only one who truly gets me. I'd nod and play along. I even offered to help him with the event's PR. "You sure you have time for this?" he asked. "You've got enough on your plate." I smiled and told him, "Family comes first." He grinned and said, "That's why you're the good one, bro." I laughed with him, but in my head, I was already writing the final line of his downfall. 2 nights before the event, I received the finished video from my designer friend. It was beautiful, haunting piano music, slow crossfades between smiling faces, laughter, and family dinners. Near the end, the narration said, "Trust is the bridge we build with those we love. When it breaks, the fall teaches us who we really are." I watched it 3 times. Then I added one last piece myself, a photo of Noah between Laura and Mark, smiling, the image from our family album. I inserted a subtle overlay of the DNA results, faint and semi-transparent, just enough that anyone paying attention could read the words paternal match, 99.9%. I didn't need to explain anything. The truth would do that for me. The next morning, Laura mentioned she was excited to see the presentation I'd prepared. "You're always so thoughtful with these things," she said. I kissed her on the forehead and replied, "It's going to be unforgettable." And it would be. Because for the first time since that cursed email, I didn't feel powerless anymore. I felt calm, methodical, dangerous in the quietest way possible. The night before the gala, I walked into Noah's room and sat beside his bed. He was asleep, holding the stuffed bear I'd given him on his first birthday. I whispered, "None of this is your fault, buddy." My throat tightened, and for the first time in months, I let myself cry, not for Laura, not for Mark, but for the life that could have been real. Then I stood up, wiped my face, and whispered to the dark, "Tomorrow, everything ends." The ballroom glowed with that practiced warmth expensive venues sell by the hour, and I walked through it wearing the kind of steady smile people thank you for because it makes them feel safe. While inside, I kept time with the plan that had lived under my ribs for weeks and refused to rush even when my pulse tried to pull ahead, since tonight was not a confrontation and not a scene. It was a slow unveiling where the room would do most of the work for me, and I would simply hold the door open, long enough for the truth to enter without tripping. Mark drifted from donor to donor with his rehearsed ease, tapping shoulders and chuckling at jokes he had probably heard at 3 other fundraisers. And Laura hovered near the stage with that brisk competence she wears when she wants to look useful rather than visible. And when our eyes met across the crowd, the muscle in her jaw flickered so quickly most would miss it. Although I saw it clearly and filed it beside everything else I had learned to notice since the email that divided my life into a before I barely remember and an after I know by heart. I asked to speak right before the video because I needed stillness to collect in the audience like water behind a dam. So when the MC sold me to the room as a loyal supporter and an old friend, I nodded to the applause and stepped into a quiet that felt almost private. And I talked about repair in a language scrubbed clean of accusation, about families that bend rather than break, about children who learn to read the weather in the adults' faces and who deserve counselors that teach them vocabulary for storms. And I thanked the sponsors with the practiced sincerity these nights are built on while I watched Mark's mouth settle into the soft smile he uses when he thinks the narrative is under control, and I watched Laura look everywhere except at me. And when I said that truth has weight, but it also has balance, the room hummed in that agreeable way crowds do when the sentence sounds profound enough to quote without obligating them to think. The lights cooled to a forgiving blue that flatters regret. The piano began its careful climb, and the first images arrived with a softness designed to disarm. Backyards and paper plates and cheap sparklers. Noah on Mark's shoulders reaching for lanterns that always looked like hope, even when they were only decorations. My mother laughing at something none of us can now remember. Laura tilting her head against mine as if a photographer could freeze permanence if given one more frame, and the murmurs around me were warm rather than suspicious, because nostalgia is the easiest mask to wear in a room that wants to like itself. I stood to the side of the screen and let the edit do what I had asked it to do, which was to cradle the audience long enough that they would not brace for the turn, and in that softened posture the music could lower its guard and the truth could walk in without having to knock. The first twist did not arrive from the screen. It entered through the rear doors in a dress that made the lights pay attention, because Elise walked in with the quiet certainty of someone who has already had the hard conversation with herself and now needs only witnesses. And when Mark saw her, the rhythm of his face skipped in a way I would have missed a year ago. Although since that private link found her inbox that afternoon with timestamps and screenshots and a short note saying that fairy tales can survive a lot, but not arithmetic. She had stopped being a future and started being a decision. And now she stood very still while the room tried to decide whether to keep watching the film or the living person changing her mind in real time. I watched him calculate the distance between the stage and her eyes and discover there was no route that would make him look like the man he enjoys performing. And I let the moment breathe because silence is an accomplice if you let it practice. Then the last movement unfolded exactly as designed, the music thinning until it sounded like someone remembering to inhale, and the photograph of Noah settled between Laura and Mark with all the warmth family pictures carry when no one interrogates them. And over that image the pale band of the report began to bloom the way ink finds water, faint and ignorable at first, and then unavoidable. The text patient and unsentimental, paternal matched 99.9%, and the room made that collective intake crowds make when they understand something they would rather debate. And I did not speak because the edit did not require my commentary, and Laura's hand flew toward her mouth with a reflex that belonged to an older version of herself, while Mark tried to keep his posture inside the image he sells to donors. And the applause that should have followed a gala reel never arrived, because the ending had instructed them that clapping would be a lie. She turned to me with a face that begged for a corridor and fewer witnesses, and she said in a voice reaching backward toward the gentler seasons that if we could please step aside, she would explain the loneliness and the timing and the way a person can convince herself that an exception is not the same as a rule. While he moved toward us with managerial concern, asking whether we could please handle this as a family, because the mission of the evening mattered more than the optics of a misunderstanding. And I let both of them stack words until they wobbled. Then I returned to the podium and thanked the guests for their generosity toward homes that have learned to live with uneven floors, and I announced that effective immediately I would endow a small scholarship called for the child of betrayal to fund counseling and educational supports for kids who become collateral when adults outsource honesty to the future. And I did not look at either of them as the titles settled over. The room like a bell that keeps ringing after the clapper rests, because the point was never to punish with volume. It was to put names on what had been stealing air. The house lights rose and conversations collapsed into whispers that sounded like paper being torn carefully rather than ripped, and Elise approached with that steady poise people mistake for coldness when it is only self-respect. And I heard her tell Mark that she had planned a life organized around trust, and that moving forward she would organize it elsewhere. And when he reached for her hand, she let the space stay open between them in a way that landed harder than anger would have done. While Laura stood beside me and asked whether I was proud of myself and whether I understood that love can be complicated and whether I realized that children need protection from public shaming more than men need tidy narratives. And I told her with the same even tone I used to read instructions that the child would be protected because the child was the point and the scholarship was the proof. And that courts are better at sorting custody than parties are at sorting truth. And she started to cry in that restrained way people cry when they are trying to keep mascara where promises used to sit. Outside, the night felt undecorated and clean. The valet line moved with the relief of being told the show was over, and I stood under the cold, bright air long enough for my shoulders to unclench not into triumph, but into steadiness, because the plan had always been calibration rather than spectacle, and the room had behaved the way truth behaves when allowed to stand on its own feet. Elise stopped beside me and said that sometimes kindness can be a scalpel if you place it in the right hands, and I told her I had only held a mirror and let people cut themselves on the edges they made. And for the first time since the email I could breathe without measuring it, since the thing that needed saying had been said by a screen and a silence, and the rest would be paperwork and patience and the slow choreography of leaving, which is not dramatic when done correctly, only precise. And as the car pulled forward, I looked back at the building and felt nothing I needed to keep, which was the clearest relief I had felt in years. Morning came like a punishment rather than a reset, because the kind of silence that follows exposure has texture, thick enough that every movement sounds like trespassing. And when I opened my eyes to the echo of my own breathing, the house felt rearranged by ghosts rather than people. The phone had already begun its slow hemorrhage of notifications, a digital autopsy conducted by friends, relatives, and strangers who had seen the video online before the event's official recording was pulled. I had posted nothing myself, but truth has a metabolism of its own once it finds oxygen, and every repost, every screenshot, every blurred commentary added another layer of permanence that no apology could sand down. Laura hadn't come home. I found her keys on the kitchen counter next to a note that said, "I need space to think," written in her careful, teacherly script that always looked like someone trying to be understood. The same phrase she used the night she first confessed a minor lie years ago, about something as stupid as forgetting to send an email. But this time there wasn't anything small enough to forgive. I poured coffee and watched the empty driveway while the caffeine did nothing but make the shaking in my hands steadier, and I told myself not to feel relief. Relief, I decided, was just exhaustion with better branding. By noon, the first calls came. My mother's voice trembled between disbelief and fury. She said, "Tell me this isn't true, Ethan." And when I didn't answer fast enough, she started crying, not for me, but for the idea of her sons. "You both were my good boys," she said. "I used to brag about how close you were." I could hear my father in the background muttering, "He's not my son anymore." And I wondered which he meant. I hung up before finding out. The next call was from Mark, which I ignored. Then came texts, first defensive, then desperate. "You've ruined my life. Please talk to me." It wasn't supposed to go this far. I stared at the screen until the words lost shape and looked like static. Eventually, I typed one sentence. That's what betrayal does. It keeps going. Then I deleted it before sending, not out of mercy, but out of boredom. Later that day, my lawyer called. "You'll need to brace for media attention," she said, sounding like someone warning a man about whether he's already drenched in. The charity statement went viral. "You might actually have donors asking to contribute." I laughed. The sound cracked like glass. I hadn't thought about that part. People were donating money to the Child of Betrayal Scholarship. They were calling it powerful, inspiring, a masterclass in reclaiming pain. I hadn't intended to inspire anyone. I just wanted to hold up a mirror and make two people look at what they'd made. But once you set truth loose in public, it stops belonging to you. It becomes performance art for strangers who think morality is a spectator sport. By evening, Laura texted, "I saw everything. I can't even recognize the person you've become." I wanted to reply, "Neither can I," but I didn't. Instead, I sent one message. "You wanted the truth. Now you live in it." She didn't respond. The next day, a journalist emailed asking for an interview. I declined, but they still wrote the story, quoting anonymous sources who described me as dignified yet broken. That phrase followed me for weeks. Dignified yet broken. Like grief in a tuxedo. When Mark finally showed up at my door 2 nights later, I was ready. He looked hollowed out, his expensive coat hanging on him like it belonged to someone healthier. He started talking before I could even invite him in, though invitation wasn't on the menu anyway. "Ethan, you don't understand. It wasn't like that at first. It was confusion. We thought you were pulling away, and Laura," I cut him off. "You don't get to narrate this," I said quietly. "You had your version for 3 years. This one's mine." He exhaled hard, like he'd been punched. "You destroyed me," he said. "You destroyed our family." I smiled, not cruelly, just honestly. "No," I said. "You built the weapon. I only showed people where you hid it." He didn't move for a long time, then finally whispered, "Mom won't speak to me. Dad told me not to come home." I shrugged. "Then maybe now you understand what being erased feels like." He muttered something that sounded like, "I'm sorry, but apologies are just punctuation marks after the damage has already been written." When he left, I watched him walk down the path toward his car, shoulders collapsing under a weight that had my initials carved into it. And I felt, not satisfaction exactly, but symmetry. That night, the house stayed mercifully quiet. Noah was with Laura's sister, and I had time to breathe. The scholarship website had doubled its donations. My inbox was full of people asking for advice, sharing their own betrayals, thanking me for standing up for dignity. I didn't answer any of them. There's nothing noble about revenge, even when it's deserved. It's just gravity. What falls must hit something. I poured another drink, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark until the phone buzzed again. A new email. The subject line read, "DNA test error, urgent correction." I didn't open it right away. Instead, I stared at it, letting the irony stretch itself thin like wire. Because if life had taught me anything lately, it was that truth never arrives once. It keeps coming back, wearing new disguises, waiting for the moment you finally think you've won. The subject line sat there for nearly an hour before I opened it, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat I didn't trust. The coffee on my desk had gone cold. The house still smelled faintly of rain and old regret. DNA test error, urgent correction. I had convinced myself it was spam, some generic update about privacy policies or data storage. But curiosity is a cruel animal. It scratches until you bleed. When I finally clicked, the screen filled with polite apology language, the kind written by lawyers to sound humane. The company explained that during a rare database merge, several results had been cross-referenced incorrectly. "We advise retesting for full confirmation," it said, "particularly for relationships involving shared family accounts." My hands went numb. The line that mattered came halfway down the message. "The paternity relationship between Noah and Mark cannot be verified as previously reported." It wasn't confirmation of innocence, only the withdrawal of guilt, which is somehow worse. My brain tried to find footing. If Mark wasn't the father, then who was? Was the test wrong completely? Or had Laura's truth been even uglier than I imagined? For a long time, I just stared at the words until they stopped meaning anything. The sound of the refrigerator turning on startled me. I'd forgotten the house could still make normal noises. I printed the email and folded it in half, once, twice, until it fit neatly into my pocket. The paper felt heavier than it should. I walked outside, needing air that hadn't heard my thoughts. The neighborhood was quiet except for a dog barking somewhere 2 streets away. I tried to picture Laura in whatever borrowed bed she was sleeping in, maybe convincing herself she was the victim of my cruelty rather than the architect of her own. Part of me wanted to call her, to shout that the entire storm might have been built on a clerical mistake. But another part, the quieter, colder part, knew that truth doesn't erase behavior. It only rewrites motive. I spent the afternoon on the phone with the testing company, listening to a customer service voice apologize with the rhythm of someone trained never to say fault. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, "please understand, this affects fewer than 1% of cases." "That's not comfort," I told her. "That's statistics wearing perfume." She offered to send a free retest kit overnight. I gave her my address, thanked her politely, and hung up. When the call ended, the house felt smaller again, like the walls were learning secrets they hadn't agreed to keep. By evening, Mark called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity again, always curiosity. His voice cracked the way old wood does underweight. "They contacted me too," he said, "about the error." I didn't respond. He went on, rushing now. "Ethan, if this was wrong, then everything you did," I cut him off. "No, Mark. Everything you did still happened. The lying, the pretending. A number on a page doesn't scrub that clean." He breathed out ragged. "You made the world think I was a monster." "I didn't have to," I said quietly. "You did that work for me. I just added lighting." He hung up after a silence that lasted longer than our childhoods. When the new test arrived 2 days later, I handled it like evidence. I followed every instruction twice, sealed the samples, mailed them, and sat on the porch until the mail truck disappeared. The waiting was worse this time because I had already burned the bridge and was now checking the ashes for directions. The scholarship fund kept growing. Strangers sent messages calling me brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt like a man trapped in the pause between breaths, unsure which truth would hurt less when it landed. Laura finally called the night before the new results were due. Her voice was calm, too calm, the way people sound when they've rehearsed. "I heard about the lab issue," she said. "You must feel what? Vindicated? Embarrassed?" I said nothing, so she continued. "You destroyed everything for a mistake." I laughed then quietly. "No, Laura. You destroyed everything for a secret. The mistake just chose its timing." She started to say something else, maybe an apology or a threat, but I ended the call. There's a dignity in silence when the other person still believes words can save them. The next morning, I woke before dawn and sat by the window until the courier arrived. The email came at noon. The company thanked me for retesting and attached the revised results. I scrolled slowly, every breath deliberate. My name, Laura's, Noah's. Relationship, father, 99. 9% probability. For a second I couldn't move. Then I laughed, a sound that felt like breaking glass and relief at the same time. Noah was mine. Always had been. The irony was surgical. Every act of revenge, every word spoken under the assumption of betrayal, now pointed backward at me. I printed the result, placed it beside the first one, and stared at them until they blurred together. 2 pieces of paper, 2 realities, 1 ruined life. The quiet around me thickened again, heavier than guilt, heavier than satisfaction. Eventually I poured a drink and whispered to no one, "I won." But even the echo didn't believe me. The day after the corrected results arrived felt like living inside a room where someone had just finished shouting, but the walls kept repeating the sound, because every place I went carried a version of my own voice amplified by strangers. And the strangest part was that none of it could be gathered back into my throat no matter how many times I wished the moment would unhappen. The scholarship page kept collecting donations with little notes attached like sympathy cards for a funeral we were all pretending to understand. And as I scrolled through them, I realized the story people loved was not my reality anymore. Yet the crowd had already learned its lines, and no director was coming to stop the play. Which meant I had to sit in my own audience and watch a version of me punish a version of them for a crime that now looked like a math error stapled to a very real betrayal. And the overlap of those 2 truths made everything sticky and impossible to untangle. Laura's statement went up first because of course it did. A tidy square on social media with a white background and black text formatted like a confession that wanted to be a lesson, where she wrote that while certain decisions in our marriage had been complicated and painful, she had never misled anyone about Noah, and that the narrative weaponized against her had been built on a faulty test compounded by a public spectacle. And she said that women are too often crushed beneath men's need to perform grief for an audience. And she ended with a line about healing that made my teeth ache, while the comments split themselves into camps that argued about privacy and patriarchy and the ethics of revenge, as if any of them had been in our kitchen at midnight watching trust dissolve like sugar in hot water. Mark followed an hour later with a message that attempted humility but smelled like publicist, saying that he was devastated by the harm caused, that he loved his family, that he had made mistakes he would regret for the rest of his life, and that he had been the victim of an error no one could have predicted, which was an elegant way of placing his sins in the shadow of my louder one. My lawyer called to talk about exposure and liability and the difference between defamation and humiliation. And as she parsed it out in her careful voice, I understood that truth is not a shield when you swing it like a blade. Because even if I could prove I believed the first report in good faith, the corrected report sat there like a new verdict. And what mattered now was not whether I was justified yesterday, but whether I had harmed people in ways the law could count, which is a colder question than right or wrong. The board of the charity asked if the scholarship name might be softened for long-term alignment, and I said the name would stand because the damage it described did not evaporate when numbers changed. But I also knew the name had become a monument to a story that had shifted under my feet, and that I had built it in marble rather than chalk, because permanence felt like justice at the time, and permanence does not care about revisions. When Laura finally came to the house, she didn't knock. She walked in like the woman who had chosen paint colors and measured curtains and learned which window stuck in winter, and she stood in the hallway like someone rehearsing how to begin a conversation that cannot be finished, and she said, in a voice that held itself together by habit, that we needed to talk about Noah before the internet made a museum of his childhood. And I told her I agreed, and that my lawyer had already started drafting a custody proposal centered on privacy. And she sat at the table where we used to pay bills and said, "You made a theater out of our pain." And I answered that there had already been a theater in our bed and in the space between brothers, and that I had only taken the curtains down. And she flinched, not because the sentence was cruel, but because it was accurate. And then she asked whether I could ever forgive her, and I said that forgiveness is a door, not an eraser, and right now the door was locked from the inside, and I did not know where the key had gone. Mark requested a meeting, and I said yes, because endings sometimes require witnesses. So we sat in a coffee shop that smelled of roasted apology, and he leaned forward with hands that wouldn't settle, and he said that he had been a coward long before the test, that he had admired my steadiness and hated it at the same time, that he had fallen into a version of himself that spoke in excuses and woke up in my living room wearing my child's laughter, and he asked me whether a man can rebuild his life after being the villain in his brother's story, and I told him that the world is generous with villains if they keep their hands visible, but that I wasn't a priest, and this wasn't confession, and he said he wanted to make it right, and I said that making something right is not the same as being forgiven, and he asked whether I would change the scholarship name for Noah's sake. And I stared at him until he looked down and understood that he doesn't get to say that name out loud anymore. Reporters kept trying to convert my silence into content, leaving messages that dangled sympathy like bait, and one afternoon a woman from a national show called to offer a healing platform for all three of us, as if the problem had been a lack of microphones, and I told her that healing doesn't need an audience and rage shouldn't get one. And after I hung up, I sat very still and realized that my own taste for spectacle had not been that different, because even though my plan had been surgical and I had convinced myself it was about truth, I had still chosen a stage, and stages make everything louder and flatter, and it is the flattening I cannot forgive in myself, the way I reduced our years to a single night, because I was too tired to keep holding the weight where it belonged. At home, I took down every photo that included Mark and placed them in a box without ceremony. Then I took down the wedding picture too, because it felt dishonest to leave it glowing in a hallway where we no longer walked together, and the walls looked naked and a little relieved. And later, I found Noah's drawing of the three of us holding hands beneath a sun that took up the whole corner. And I stood there longer than a man should stand in a doorway, considering whether paper can accuse you. And when Laura came to pick him up, she paused at the blank spaces on the wall and said, "You're erasing him." And I said, "I'm archiving." And she closed her eyes like a person trying to swallow a stone, and we talked gently in front of Noah, because that is a rule we both agree on, with sentences that bent around him like tall grass. And before they left, he asked me whether the scholarship was for him, and I said it was for children who had to learn new words faster than they learned their times tables. And he nodded in the serious way children do when they understand the shape of something without touching its edges. At night, the house became an editing room where I replayed the gala, and paused on frames to see whether I could have softened anything without dulling the truth. And the answer arrived with the patience of a slow teacher, telling me that even truth grows fangs when you teach it to bite, and that once a story catches fire, the person who lit the match doesn't get to tell the flames where to stop. And I lay there letting the heat wash through me without claiming victory or calling it regret, because neither word fit anymore, and because the consequences were not a lesson for anyone but me. And what I learned is that revenge feels like balance until the scales keep swinging after you step away, at which point you realize you did not build justice. You built momentum, and momentum doesn't care who it carries next. It's strange how quickly scandal becomes routine, how noise exhausts itself until even curiosity gets tired. A month after the correction, the world had already moved on to some newer, shinier tragedy. But silence doesn't mean peace. It just means everyone else has stopped watching. I thought that would bring relief, but what it really brought was space, too much of it, to listen to the echo of what I'd done. Every morning, I'd open my laptop and see the charity dashboard climbing higher, the donations still coming in like an aftershock that didn't know when to quit. People still wrote messages about healing, forgiveness, the power of truth. They didn't know the truth had changed. I could have shut it down. I could have released a statement, told everyone the test was wrong, admitted my revenge had been built on sand. But I didn't. I told myself it was to protect Noah, but that was only half of it. The other half was fear. Fear that admitting I was wrong would turn me into the villain of my own story. Laura's lawyer called first, her voice like ice in a velvet box. She said they were considering defamation with damages, and that even if we didn't go to court, I should be aware of the optics. I almost laughed. Optics. That word had become the currency of our lives. Tell her, I said, that optics were her favorite game. I just learned to play it better. The lawyer paused before replying. This isn't about winning anymore, Mr. Hayes. But it had never been about winning. It was about balance, and now I wasn't sure which way the scale leaned. When I hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time, wondering when revenge had stopped being a wound and started being a habit. Mark wrote me a letter, handwritten, like he was trying to reach an older version of us. He said he'd moved out of state, that he was starting fresh, that he wished I'd find a way to do the same. He said he'd forgiven me. Forgiven me. The word burned hotter than any insult could. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it back into the envelope and dropped it into the fireplace. It curled slowly, the ink turning to ghosts before disappearing. I didn't hate him anymore. Hatred takes energy, and I'd spent mine already. What I felt now was something quieter, colder, like watching the tide pull back after a storm and realizing it's taken everything, even the sand. The fallout had rearranged more than reputations. Friends picked sides without saying so. My parents spoke to me again, but cautiously, as though I might combust mid-conversation. My mother wanted to see Noah, and I let her. She cried when she saw him. He looks just like you did at that age, she whispered. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Because he did. He always had. I'd been too blind to see it before. Every time he laughed, every stubborn expression, it was mine, not Mark's. The truth I'd missed had been written in his face from the beginning. One afternoon, I went to pick Noah up from school. His teacher smiled politely, that careful smile adults reserve for people they've read about online. On the way home, Noah asked, Dad, why did people online say mean things about Mom? I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Sometimes adults make mistakes, I said, and sometimes people talk about them even when they shouldn't. He nodded, thinking it over. Did you make a mistake too? I hesitated. Yes, I said quietly. A big one. He looked out the window for a while, then said, Okay, I forgive you. I almost had to pull the car over. Children forgive so easily, not because they understand, but because they still believe everyone deserves another start. That night, I logged into the charity page and stared at the banner that had once been my triumph. For the child of betrayal. The name hit differently now. It wasn't just theirs, it was mine too. Betrayal had been the only language we'd spoken, each of us fluent in a different dialect. I drafted a post. Nothing dramatic. No confession, no apology to the world. Just one line. Sometimes the truth changes, but what we learn from it shouldn't. I renamed the fund the Second Chance Scholarship and disabled comments. For the first time in months, the silence that followed didn't feel like punishment. Laura saw the change before I told her. She sent a short text that said, "Thank you for doing that." I replied it was time. Nothing else. There was nothing else to say. We had spent years trying to outlast the damage, and now we were just two people quietly acknowledging the wreckage. That, I realized, was the real undoing. Not the exposure, not the lawsuits or the gossip, but the slow, steady unmaking of everything that had once felt certain. Later that week, I found myself sitting outside on the porch after Noah went to bed. The air was cool, the kind that smells like beginnings even when it's carrying the end. I thought about how revenge doesn't die when it's over. It lingers like smoke, reminding you of the fire you started and the walls you burned to feel warm again. Maybe someday, when Noah is older, I'll tell him everything. Not as a warning, not as a confession, but as a story about how truth, when turned into a weapon, always cuts both ways. And maybe he'll understand that the hardest part of revenge isn't the planning or the act. It's learning to live with the silence after it's done. That night, I finally slept without dreaming. Not peacefully, not yet, but without ghosts. And in a way, that was enough. The email came late on a Thursday, a time when the world is too tired for surprises. I was half watching some meaningless news segment, the kind that fills the room with borrowed voices so you don't have to listen to your own, when my phone vibrated on the table. The sender line was familiar now, genetic services support. My first instinct was to ignore it. I'd already had enough truth for several lifetimes. But the subject line, follow-up findings, extended paternal data review, pulled me in like gravity. The message began with polite sentences about transparency and ongoing audits. But my eyes skipped down to the highlighted section that said, during additional verification of biological relationships, a third-party genetic correlation was detected within the same regional cluster. This individual has been notified separately for confidentiality reasons. Please contact us if you wish to discuss potential implications. I read it twice before my mind caught up. There was someone else, someone connected to Noah. At first I assumed it was another error, another bureaucratic wound dressed up as science. But there was a phone number at the bottom for further inquiries, and before I could talk myself out of it, I dialed. The representative, a young man whose voice tried to sound older, confirmed that a partial match had appeared in the database. It's not immediate family, he explained, but the probability suggests a close paternal relative, uncle, cousin, possibly father if previous data was inconclusive. The word father landed like a nail. Who? I asked. He hesitated, explaining that privacy laws prevented disclosure without consent, but if the other party agreed, we could share contact details through a secure portal. He's been notified, the man added gently. So if he's willing, you'll hear from him soon. I thanked him automatically, hung up, and sat staring at the dark reflection in the television screen, a mirror of a man who had already run out of ground to stand on. For 2 days nothing happened. I told myself it would stay that way, that whoever this person was, he'd ignore it, that the universe was finally done with its cruel hobby of revelation. Then an email arrived from a name I didn't recognize, Thomas Lane. The first line was short, "We might need to talk. I think we're both part of the same mistake." The message included a phone number. I read it over and over, tracing every possibility. When I finally called, the voice on the other end sounded calm in the way only shock can sound. Thomas said he had been adopted and had recently taken a test to find biological relatives. "Your son's profile showed up," he said quietly. "The connection is strong, too strong to ignore." I felt my mouth go dry. "So you're saying?" "I'm saying," he continued, "that I think your wife and I met a long time ago, before she met you. We dated briefly. I never knew she'd been pregnant." The room tilted. I asked when. He mentioned a year that sat uncomfortably close to when Laura and I had first started seeing each other. That uncertain overlap between almost and official. "It was nothing serious," he said, his tone apologetic, as if that softened it. "We lost touch. I moved overseas for work." He explained that he'd come back recently and, out of curiosity, sent in a test to find his biological family. I wasn't expecting to find this. There was no malice in his voice, just bewildered decency. We talked for a long time, too long for strangers connected by accident. When we hung up, I realized my hands were trembling again. The same tremor I'd felt that first night months ago when the world cracked open under a single click. I didn't tell Laura right away. I needed to confirm it myself. Needed proof that the universe wasn't just recycling my paranoia. The next day, I contacted the company again, requesting confirmation through official documentation. 2 days later, the report arrived. Thomas Lane, 99. 8% probability. Biological father of Noah Hayes. The page blurred before my eyes. The line between betrayal and coincidence had finally collapsed. All the rage I'd poured into Mark, all the elaborate revenge I'd built like a monument, all of it had been aimed at the wrong man. My entire war had been misdirected from the start. That night, I called Laura. She answered on the third ring, voice wary. "What now?" she asked. I told her about the new results, about Thomas, about the conversation. The silence that followed wasn't surprise, it was recognition. She already knew. "It was before us," she said finally, her tone small. "I didn't think it mattered. I never wanted to lie to you, Ethan. It just didn't seem necessary." I laughed, quiet, broken laughter that tasted like ash. "Didn't seem necessary," I repeated. "To tell me my son might not be mine?" "He is yours," she said fiercely. "You raised him. You loved him. That's what counts." And maybe she was right in some moral universe I no longer believed in. But in this one, words like counts and matters had lost all meaning. After we hung up, I poured a drink and sat on the floor beside the cold fireplace. I kept thinking about Mark, how he had carried guilt for something he hadn't done, how I destroyed him for being the nearest target. I thought about the gala, the lights, the gasps, the scholarship, the headlines, all of it built on a single wrong assumption. The realization didn't come as guilt. It came as exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones until even breathing feels like a confession. Later that week, Thomas and I met. We shook hands in a quiet cafe, both aware that nothing we said could make sense of what had happened. He showed me pictures of his family, his parents, the life he'd lived far away. "I'm not here to take anything," he said softly. "I just needed to understand." I nodded. "You have every right." We talked about Noah, his smile, his energy, his curiosity. "You've done a good job," he said, and it almost undid me. When we parted, he thanked me for meeting. I told him he wasn't the first ghost I'd met this year. That night, I watched Noah sleep, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the small, unconscious frown he made when dreaming. My son, or someone's. The difference no longer mattered, but the knowledge still hurt. Revenge had been the easy part. Living after it was the real punishment. I finally understood that truth doesn't heal, it only stops lying. And sometimes, that's the same thing as pain. The last time Laura came to the house, the sky had that washed-out color that doesn't promise weather, only duration, and I remember thinking how appropriate it was for an ending that no longer needed thunder. She stood in the doorway holding a folder, the same one she used to keep our mortgage papers in. And for a second the image made something in my chest twist, because endings always were the clothes of beginnings. She said she wanted to talk in person about Noah, about the next chapter, as if naming it could make it orderly. I led her into the living room, the air between us as formal as a courtroom. Noah was at a friend's house, the silence around us complete. She handed me the folder without a word. Inside were court documents, custody agreements, a letter from her lawyer, and at the very back, a small photograph of Noah from his last birthday party, frosting smeared on his face, eyes bright, laughing at something just out of frame. "He looks happy," I said quietly. "He is," she answered. "He deserves to stay that way." Then she looked at me for the first time in months, really looked, and said, "Ethan, I know you hate me, but please don't hate him through me. Whatever biology says, he's still the same boy who runs to you when he's scared of thunderstorms." Her voice cracked. "You're the only father he's ever known." I nodded, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement of fact. Biology had destroyed us, but it hadn't built him. He was his own truth, separate from the wars of adults. "I don't hate him," I said. "I just don't know how to keep loving through this much debris." She sat down across from me, folding her hands like someone praying without faith. "Then maybe you start by not trying to fix it. Just show up." For a moment we were quiet. The clock on the wall ticked like something reminding us time still believed in movement even when we didn't. She told me she'd spoken to Thomas. "He doesn't want anything," she said. "No contact, no role, nothing. He just needed to know." I believed her. Thomas had written me too, a short email saying he was moving abroad again, that some truths are best left small. "I wish you peace," he'd written. whatever form that takes. I hadn't replied, partly because there was nothing to say, partly because peace felt like an insult when you hadn't earned it. When Laura stood to leave, she hesitated by the door. "You could tell everyone the truth," she said. "It would clear your name. People would understand you were wronged, too, just in a different way." I thought about that, about writing a statement, another public post, another attempt to control a story that had long stopped listening to me. But the idea made me tired. "No," I said finally. "Let them believe whatever version makes sense. The noise has had enough of my voice." She studied me for a moment, maybe looking for cruelty, maybe for mercy, but found only the middle ground where both live when they've run out of energy. "Then I guess this is it," she said. I nodded. "It's been it for a long time." After she left, I poured a drink and walked out to the backyard where the grass still bore faint scars from the old swing set. The air smelled of dust and faint rain. I sat on the steps and listened to the neighborhood hum. Dogs, traffic, a child's laughter somewhere far away. For the first time in months, my anger didn't have anywhere to go, and in its place was something quieter, heavier, acceptance, or something close enough to pass for it. Revenge had promised symmetry, but life isn't geometry, it's weather. You don't balance it. You just learn which storms you can survive standing still. Later that week, I went to Noah's school play. He spotted me in the crowd, grinned, and waved with the unself-conscious joy of someone whose heart hasn't learned caution yet. He didn't care who was sitting beside me, who wasn't. When he finished his line, a small, proud sentence about courage, the audience clapped, and he looked directly at me as if to check whether I was proud too. I was. That moment, simple and undeserved, was the closest thing to forgiveness I'd ever receive. When I got home that night, I opened the laptop one last time. The charity site still existed, quietly gathering small donations. I updated the page description, for every child born from the silence adults refused to break. Then I turned off the computer, unplugged it, and left it dark. The next morning I woke early, made coffee, and watched the first light crawl across the floorboards. The world hadn't changed, but something in me finally had. A shift, subtle and permanent, like the way a scar stops aching once you've accepted that it will never fade. I realized then that revenge had never been about justice. It had been a way to keep the conversation going after love had stopped answering. And now, at last, there was nothing left to say. I finished my coffee, grabbed my jacket, and stepped outside. The air was sharp but clean, the kind of morning that smells like the truth. Not cruel, not kind, just honest. I locked the door behind me, feeling the click like punctuation. Whatever story this had been, it was finally done, and for the first time in a long time, the silence that followed belonged to me.